So hello and welcome to our webinar. My name is Alice Valvodova and I'm Head of Consult at RCS Global. Today's webinar will examine how mandatory supply chain due diligence rules are impacting stakeholders like companies, investors and standards owners. And it will be the first in a series of webinars which RCS Global is organizing this year. Our next webinar will take place at the end of June, and it will focus on establishing due diligence management systems that are able to respond to emerging regulatory and market developments. For those of you who don't know RCS Global, we're an international advisory and audit firm, and our activities focus on responsible sourcing and supply chain mapping, responsible mining, ESG performance and traceability. Our clients include downstream automotive and electronics manufacturing companies, midstream processors and refiners, and upstream mining companies. We have a number of business units to deliver our activities, including the Consult business unit, which is organizing today's webinar, as well as an audit and mapping practice, a digital solutions unit, and better mining. We are working to create transparent value chains that are demonstrably responsible. For example, we're supporting initiatives such as the battery passport, and we have a global presence with offices in Berlin, in Mexico, in Shenzhen, in China, in New Zealand, and in Rwanda and the DRC. And as you can see on this slide, we're doing a good job, and we're also getting noticed in international media such as the Financial Times, Forbes, and the BBC. In terms of the agenda for today's webinar, so the first half of the webinar will focus on providing you with an overview and the implications of the current landscape of due diligence regulation, which is impacting responsible sourcing and mining standards. And you'll hear from multiple stakeholders, including a regulator, a standards owner, an investor, and a downstream company about the practical impacts of due diligence regulation. The second half of the webinar will comprise a facilitated panel discussion and a Q&A, and this is where you will have the opportunity to ask questions to our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our all-female panel of responsible sourcing and mining experts, and they're amongst the brightest minds and key influencers in this field. And today, our panelists include Tatiana Kakara, who is Policy Assistant at the European Commission at DG Trade, Rebecca Burton, who is Director of Corporate Engagement at IRMA, Sachi Suzuki, who is Senior ESG Analyst at HSBC, and Francisca Quiliches, who is responsible for Sustainability Management Procurement at Volkswagen Group and Brand. Before we begin, let me briefly cover some housekeeping rules. You will be muted throughout the duration of this webinar. If you would like to ask a question to our panelists, then please submit it in writing in the questions panel feature in Zoom. And finally, a recording will be made available of this webinar on the RCS Global website and also our YouTube channel. So let me begin by giving you a brief introduction to the concept of due diligence. So essentially, many companies in the minerals value chain are already undertaking due diligence on a voluntary basis, and the three sort of guiding frameworks that they have been using in this context are the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict affected and high risk areas, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And all of these frameworks define a continuous improvement process to identify and assess due diligence risks, to mitigate those risks, and to externally report on them. And on this slide, you can see a comparison of the due diligence process as it's outlined in these three guiding frameworks. And as you can see, there is a lot of overlap in terms of the actions which they recommend. Practically speaking, they involve or they recommend setting up management systems for due diligence, as well as making public commitments, establishing policies and processes, identifying and assessing risks in the supply chain, mitigating those risks, and then finally, externally reporting on them. Now, over the last decade, there has been an increase in due diligence action by companies, and there's a shift from voluntary to mandatory due diligence. And as you can see on this slide, particularly over the last decade, there's been an emergence of due diligence regulation globally. Some of it's already in effect, and some of it's still in the process of being developed and passed. And specifically, over the past 5 years, the European Union has been sort of setting the bar for due diligence regulation globally, and due diligence regulation in the EU has been coming fast. But you can also see on this slide that a number of countries in Europe and beyond have established due diligence laws at the national level. And if we look at the overall picture, you can see that sort of Europe is currently dominating the landscape, and there are multiple legislative processes relating to due diligence that are currently ongoing. So most recently, a new proposal for a sustainable corporate due diligence directive was issued, and this would mandate ESG due diligence in operations and supply chain. There is also ongoing implementation of the EU conflict minerals regulation, and Tatiana will speak about regulation is expected to be agreed at the end of this summer. EU non-financial reporting rules are also being updated. And then there's also the EU taxonomy regulation, whereby technical screening criteria to define environmentally sustainable economic activities are being defined. So globally, we can see that at least 7 human rights focused due diligence laws were passed over the last decade. And you can also see that in the last 5 years or so, the scope of due diligence has very much expanded to cover ESG issues, and has gone beyond human rights to also include environmental aspects. It's also notable, as you can see on this slide, that only 6 of the due diligence laws here refer to the guiding frameworks for due diligence, which I mentioned earlier. So that's the OECD guidance, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and the UN guiding principles. And only 2 of them actually incorporate the possibility to formally recognize existing industry schemes to achieve regulatory compliance. If we look at the practical impacts on companies of all this due diligence regulation, so first of all, it sets specific and measurable requirements for due diligence, and it's either impacting companies directly or indirectly in the minerals value chain. The scope is also extending to more companies and sectors, so that's another trend. There is extraterritorial reach of the regulations. So one example of that would be, for example, a global company generating a certain amount of revenue in the European Union being subject to regulation, or having registered subsidiaries. And as I mentioned before, the scope is also expanding beyond human rights to cover ESG issues. So what are some of the practical challenges that companies are facing as a result? One is the fragmentation in the due diligence requirements and sort of making sense and overall coherence of the various laws that are out there. Another challenge is just the clarity or lack of clarity of the requirements and understanding how they align. Different laws and regulations may impact the possibility of a level playing field. Another challenge has been delays with recognizing existing industry schemes for the purpose of compliance. Information deficiencies are another challenge, as companies may simply not have the information to be able to conduct supply chain due diligence or to provide that information to their customers. And there are obvious costs related to compliance. So establishing a due diligence management system requires the allocation of appropriate resources to keep it going. However, there's also an opportunity to understand how regulatory compliance can be achieved through the adoption of recognized voluntary standards and participation in industry schemes, and how they actually converge in enabling companies to reach compliance. I'll just briefly speak about how RCS Global can help. So I mentioned earlier that we're working with companies from across the minerals supply chain. We can help companies conduct a gap assessment of their responsible sourcing approach, either against regulatory requirements or good practice standards. We can help them establish due diligence management systems that take into account the requirements of different regulation, as well as incorporate voluntary standards, external reporting on due diligence, but also training on implementation of responsible sourcing approaches and stakeholder engagement. So after this brief introduction, I would like to hand over to Tatiana Kakara from the European Commission, who will talk about how the EU conflict minerals regulation incorporates good practice standards and any sort of opportunities and challenges thereof. So Tatiana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alice, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss the EU conflict minerals regulation, or so-called conflict minerals regulation. So the regulation covering 4 minerals and metals, so the so-called 3TG, tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. I will be very brief, so I will speak for about 5 minutes, and I would like to focus perhaps on 3 main areas. First of all, to give you a very, very brief overview of the regulation, what it entails, what are the tools that we have at our disposal, and specifically also then zooming in at the second stage at the recognition of schemes and good practice responsible sourcing standards, and how these are included in the conflict minerals regulation, how this works in practice, and what are some of the practical challenges in this process. And then at a third stage, I will try to zoom out again and look a little bit again at the broader picture. As Elise explained very well, there are several pieces of regulation coming up. So within this broader sustainability regulatory framework, what is the role of the conflict minerals regulation, and what is possibly a future outlook, to the extent, of course, that we can speak to this at this stage. So perhaps very briefly on the regulation per se, its overall objectives, the scope. It's important to note, first of all, that in terms of geographical scope, the regulation has a global scope. So in principle, any country could be covered. Of course, there is a particular focus on the so-called conflict-affected high-risk areas, as the regulation is in a way transposing the OECD guidance that Alice referred to earlier into, let's say, EU law. It imposes mandatory due diligence obligations for upstream. And of course, it also covers indirectly the downstream and other actors in the supply chain. So we will speak specifically about the key tools of the regulation. So first of all, one of them is the implementation of the methodology of the OECD for the recognition of schemes. Then we have a supporting tool, which is the creation of a list of conflict affected and high risk areas. And also, very briefly, the implementation that is done primarily by the member states, the member state competent authorities that are responsible for the harmonized implementation. So very, very briefly, first of all, the due diligence obligations follow and transpose the guidance of the OECD. And member states are responsible for monitoring this, for ensuring uniform implementation, and for conducting the so-called ex-post compliance checks for EU importers. It's important to note, and I think this is very important to bear in mind also when we talk about the future outlook, that the regulation, while it was adopted in 2017, it only started being fully applicable, and the operational due diligence requirements started applying only in January last year, so in January 2021, which means that effectively it has been in full application for a year and a couple of months. And the first year that member states will conduct ex-post compliance checks will be this year for 2021. And they have the obligation to report this to the Commission by the end of June this year, which means that it might be very soon to tell exactly what are the impacts or what are the particular challenges on the implementation. Then on the list of conflict affected and high risk areas, this is a non-exhaustive supporting tool that has been created by an external contractor with the support of the Commission. And this is, as I said, a non-exhaustive list, just an indicative list to support and help and guide. It's a public available list, so to guide companies and individuals. The list is regularly updated. It has first been published in December 2020. I can try to put the link in the chat if this is available. And it is regularly updated. The next upcoming update is expected this week. And as I said, it can be publicly consulted. And then I think what is important to zoom in here and to focus more specifically is the recognition of schemes. Importantly to note that the Commission and the European Union are the first to regulate this. It's the first time that there is an instrument where the recognition of schemes and the OECD methodology is applied. So the Commission has adopted a delegated regulation in 2019, setting out the specific conditions and the framework for the recognition of schemes. At the moment, we have a total of 6 supply chain due diligence schemes that have applied for recognition. Some of them are a bit more advanced in the assessment. I believe in one of the previous slides shared by Alice, you could see also the different steps in the OECD methodology in the assessment process. A key step in this process of recognition of schemes is, of course, the audits. This is also one of, let's say, the challenges we have had in this process, notably also due to COVID. There have been some delays with conducting these audits, and also the shadow audits that are then conducted by the Commission and the independent consultants that are performing these assessments on behalf of the European Commission. So I would say this is one of the key challenges that we have, that at this point in time, no scheme is recognized yet because of these delays. But we believe this is a very, very useful tool, because it really, on the one hand, facilitates the compliance with the requirements of the regulation through such schemes, because there is, let's say, a trusted, global, responsible list of smelters and refiners that shall be drawn up after schemes are recognized, and I will come back to this in a moment. And at the same time, it's very important for the Commission to ensure that the schemes also effectively meet the standards of the conflict minerals regulation, So we have to be very careful with this process and when we recognize the schemes. We believe we're very close to recognizing some of the schemes, but of course, this is still an ongoing process. And as I mentioned before, following up this scheme recognition, the Commission aims at establishing a global list of responsible smelters and refiners, which also is intended to facilitate the compliance of EU importers with the requirements of the regulation, and avoid, of course, then double auditing obligations and extra, let's say, red tape. So I'm very, very happy to respond to any questions on the supply chain due diligence schemes and the recognition process. As I said, I think this is a very important tool that is for the first time being introduced with this regulation. And given even though we have these COVID delays, we believe it's a very important tool to facilitate the implementation of the regulation, and also to help the implementation for the member state competent authorities who have then the certainty that they can rely on a recognized scheme. And then perhaps in the interest of time, I will try also to zoom out and touch a little bit upon the future outlook and perspectives for the conflict minerals regulation. Of course, it's important to note that in terms of scope, I mentioned the geographical scope, but also in terms of what is covered, the aim of the regulation is to curtail opportunities of armed groups to trade in those minerals and metals. So it's a conflict prevention primarily, and it also hopes to tackle severe human rights abuse. So the focus is very much on conflict and human rights. Environmental considerations at this stage are outside the scope of the regulation. So this is important to note that while we have other instruments, as Alice mentioned, that focus also on environmental sustainability, the minerals regulation in its current form does not, and it also covers the specific 4 minerals and metals that I referred to in the beginning. Perhaps when it comes to the future outlook, is important again to remind that the regulation has been in application for 1 year and a few months, so it might be very early to tell what are the real impacts on the ground. Of course, a key issue is also, that has also been mentioned by Alice, is certain information gaps that we have, and we will try to look at more closely and try to overcome also in the framework of the review of the regulation that is due for next year. So by 2023, the Commission is expected to deliver a report to the European Parliament and the Council on the functioning and effectiveness of the regulation. It's important to highlight here that given the very limited time that the regulation has been in application, this report will really look at do a first overview of and try to identify some initial findings of the functioning and effectiveness of the regulation on the ground. Because as I mentioned previously, we have had some delays with the recognition of schemes, and also we do not yet have findings at our disposal from the member states' perspective on the implementation. And it's also a crucial point, I think, to really distinguish what is the impact on the ground of the EU regulation, or for example, of the Dodd-Frank Act or other regulations, and to really distinguish and be able to attribute specific impacts to specifically the conflict minerals regulation. But these are all questions we're going to be looking at in the framework of the review. And perhaps as a last point also, it might be useful to mention that we are very well aware and we are trying to harmonize and to look at during the different impact assessment phases of all the different regulations that Alice mentioned earlier, to look at the cumulative impacts of all those regulatory frameworks. So and to ensure that there is understanding and harmony and alignment between them. So this will also be a key task of the review of the regulation, of the conflict minerals regulation, to look at the other regulations that have come up in the meantime. This is the Commission proposal for batteries regulation, the Commission proposal that recently came out on the 23rd of February on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, also an upcoming proposal, the so-called Sustainable Product Initiative, revising the Eco-Design Directive, deforestation proposal, and so on. So there are several new initiatives coming up. And one of the tasks of the review of the regulation will be to try at least to have a preliminary idea of what are potential overlaps with those other pieces of legislation. Of course, the idea is that the conflict minerals regulation is in a way lex specialis. So the purpose of it is to cover the specificities of the supply chain of these 4 minerals and metals. But of course, there might be certain overlaps for larger companies with the sustainability, corporate sustainability due diligence directive, and a different scope, for example, environment. And before giving the floor back to Alice, I would like to conclude on this remark and to say that while, as I said in the beginning, the conflict minerals regulation focuses on human rights, covers the specific minerals and metals, part of the assessment of its functioning and effectiveness is, of course, also to ask and just pose the question at this stage. And this, I want to be very clear, it's not a review that will change the content of the regulation, but it will give some initial vectors of areas where we would then look at for the first proper review that will be conducted in 2026. And it is important to note that also these questions of scope. So would the inclusion of other minerals and metals, for example, and notably cobalt, have an effect on the effectiveness and functioning of the regulation? Or would the inclusion of environmental consideration or worker safety, labor considerations in the scope, would this have an effect on the functioning and effectiveness of the regulation? All these are questions that we cannot respond to at this stage, but we will be looking at in the framework of the review, for which there is also, since Friday, I believe on the 25th, an open call for tender that has been published on the official journal of the European Commission for an external study to support the Commission with the preparation of this review report. So on that note, I will conclude, and I'm very, very happy to respond to any questions afterwards in the Q&A on any of these complex regulatory questions and framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for your intervention. And it's great to hear that the European Commission will be examining the overall policy coherence of the different laws and initiatives. So in the interest of time, I will now hand over to Rebecca, who will speak about the impact that due diligence regulation has had on IRMA adoption. And Rebecca, I have your slides, so give me a sign, and I'll switch to the next slide. Over to you.
That's great. Thank you, Alice. It's excellent to be here. I'll jump right in and just speak to what IRMA is ultimately and how it relates to due diligence. So we see IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, as a tool for due diligence in understanding practices at mine sites. It's a tool for various tiers in the supply chain, whether consumer-facing brands or other tiers between the mine and the market. So what is IRMA? As you can see here, it's 2 components. On one side is the standard, and on the other side is the third-party assurance system. So if you can move forward in the slide, you can see here that basically for 10 years, what happened is that representatives from across stakeholder lines sat together across the table and created the standard for responsible mining. They worked together to set a series of rigorous high bar requirements defining what it means to mine responsibly. And it was really important that all of these actors be around the table because it ensures that every stakeholder is heard and every perspective is ultimately represented in the standard. So mining is at the table to ensure that the standard is practicable and applicable. Civil society is there to point out where we need to go and where we need to change. And if you go to the next slide, this demonstrates, oh, sorry, I'll come to that later actually, but just that basically the importance of the standard being created through a multi-stakeholder system. It covers 26 issue areas. It's all of the areas that are important topics when it comes to mining. And while the requirements are important, it really comes down to how in terms of IRMA and what sets it apart, it really comes down to the fact that the standards and the requirements were shaped by that multi-stakeholder collaboration. And then the other piece of it, that second piece that you saw on the first slide, is the importance of how the audits are actually done. And so this is all about transparency and inclusivity. You can see here audits before they happen are publicly noticed, allowing stakeholders to come in and be interviewed. When auditors go to do the audit, they actually interview far beyond the mine site, ensuring that there's a holistic representation of how the practices at the mine site are actually being conducted. We do community outreach after the audits as well to share with communities what have the audits actually found and how can they use the reports to ask for change. And then those reports are freely and publicly available to all stakeholders, civil society, purchasers, whoever it might be in the supply chain, ultimately to drive more responsible performance. So this question of sort of how is IRMA either influencing due diligence regulation or how is it due diligence regulation influencing IRMA adoption? I'll speak to the first question briefly. I mean, the idea is that IRMA is a tool. And so we say to governments and we say, you know, to those who are making the regulation, here is the work of 10 years. Use it, adopt it, put it into regulation where it makes sense, and also tell us where it might not be a fit in certain circumstances and how it can be approved. We know that there are so many areas where governments need to focus, right, in terms of economies and health and everything that they're looking at in terms of the well-being of nations. And so we say, here we are, having worked for 10 years, bringing together all of the constituents that you care about. And here is a tool, IRMA is a tool for you that defines what it means to mine responsibly. And we agree with civil society who is at the table, who is at our table to say that ultimately we do need to move beyond voluntary initiatives. So right now, however, I mean, IRMA is a voluntary system and it is driven by the market. And ultimately, I believe we're setting an example of what can be achieved anywhere in the world. And we're demonstrating the need for consistent and high bar expectations so that harm doesn't continue to be exported to a place with weaker rules, right? To have that consistency of expectation that can be measured anywhere in the world. And then on the next slide, just to point out a few ways that IRMA is at the table. And I think it's important here to note that this usually IRMA comes to these places generally from the recommendations of our stakeholders and our members. And again, that may be, as you saw in the slide, of the various stakeholders that we represent, whether it's companies that buy mined materials, mining companies, civil society, impacted communities. They are the ones who are out. There are many instances where they are basically asking for IRMA as the type of standard that they would like to see. And so in turn, IRMA has been referenced, for example, by the European Parliament, encouraging the Commission to take IRMA standard as a starting point in terms of looking at critical raw materials. SUMEX, which was funded by the European Commission, that looks at extraction within the EU, recommended that IRMA be the common standard to describe responsible mining. We are also working on the OECD Environmental Working Group. And then in the US, the White House has also referenced the IRMA standard as a potential roadmap for best practices. So I just point to this in a couple of places to say sort of where we're seeing the adoption, where we're seeing the uptake, where we're seeing governments looking at IRMA as a potential framework and a tool to ultimately put into regulation. So I would actually just end here. I know I just want to keep it brief. We have 2 others to hear, so I want to give them time. And I'll just say on the last slide, I think it is, yes, perfect. So just the unique attributes of IRMA that ultimately we believe make it a really powerful tool for due diligence is this multi-stakeholder governance of the system that determines what goes into the standard. It determines how audits are conducted, and again, bringing in all perspectives to the table. You have highly detailed requirements, which is key for auditing. Auditors have told us that actually the more detailed, the better. It helps much more with objectivity at the mine rather than them having to make a subjective call. Then you have the comprehensive coverage. So IRMA can be applied to any mine material anywhere in the world. And then you have this transparency in audits. Again, that allows anyone to come to the table. And then the inclusivity of audits ensures that, again, stakeholder perspectives are being heard, not just those that are occurring at the mine site. And then finally, these detailed public reports that are freely and publicly available on our website that bring really an unprecedented level of transparency into what is happening at the mine site, and allows a call for continuous change and improvement. So I'll close there just to continue and allow the panel to go on. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. It's been super interesting to hear how it is positively shaping, but how it's also being shaped by due diligence regulation. So now I'll hand over to Sachi Suzuki, who will talk about how due diligence regulation is impacting ESG investments and investor decisions. So over to you, Sachi.
Thank you, everyone. Very pleased to be here. I'm Sachi Suzuki from HSBC Asset Management. I'm based in London. I joined the team about 3 months ago, but I have been doing a similar role in my previous employer, Federated Hermes, as well. So my role is, I'm part of this wider responsible investment team, but within that I am responsible for stewardship and engagement with companies that we invest in. So me and myself and my other team members, our role is to engage with companies to improve their practice in various different areas, including environmental, social, and governance, and to eventually improve corporate value and value for investors. And within wider team of HSBC's asset management, there's other members that we're also involved in kind of scoring, rating efforts, but also people working more on product development to reflect stock selection and things like that. But my primary role is to do engagement as well as voting at AGM. So we engage with a number of different companies in different locations, geographies, across different sectors. So we, as well as we, are engaging with buyers of minerals in this context. So they're final product manufacturers like OEM car manufacturers or electric devices companies. But we also engage with other people in the value chain, sometimes battery manufacturers, for example, and to ensure that they all have an appropriate due diligence process in place. So there are a number of different regulations in different markets, and some are specific to conflict of minerals, responsible sourcing, but there are other regulations, rules that are more broadly on human rights and due diligence and supply chain. And they are also very relevant to our work. And there are many regulations, Tatiana mentioned, just in the EU and member states. but also in the US, Australia, and now even Japan's planning to develop a new supply chain due diligence guidelines in the near future. So these all affect investors sort of indirectly through the companies that we work with. But we also often act before those regulations are put in place. So we identify issues first, and then we press companies to aim for best practice, because we don't want companies to just do bare minimum legal compliance, and then this applies to all other areas and themes. And in fact, HSBC has been working on the issue of cobalt supply chain, for example, for a number of years, well before those immediate direct regulations were introduced. And also in my previous role, I engaged with a number of companies on conflict minerals and cobalt supply chain for a number of years, since around the time of Dodd-Frank Act was first introduced, or was about to be introduced. So it's not a new theme for us, but then regulatory landscape changes all the time, and there are a lot of learning to do for us. And so we work with various stakeholders, including people like RCS and other industry experts, to keep learning, and also work with many other investors. There are lots of investor-led initiatives to collectively engage on these issues, as well as many other. And there are other sets of regulations that affect investors more directly. For example, the EU has developed a taxonomy for sustainable activities. This is to clarify which economic activities are considered sustainable. And there's a lot of focus on environmental sustainability in this taxonomy through 6 different areas that they look through. But there is also a minimum safeguards relating to human rights. So the activities have to be aligned with OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and as well as the UN guiding principles on business human rights. And with this taxonomy, the EU also introduced a sustainable finance disclosure regulations, and these SFDR requires asset managers like ourselves and other participants in the financial market to disclose how ESG factors are integrated in their products and activities. And particularly the Article 8 to 9 of the SFDR are relevant to us. Article 8 funds will have to have environmental or social characteristics, and Article 8 and 9 funds will have to have sustainable investment as their objectives, to say. So investors like us need to constantly think about developing new products to meet these specific requirements, and also to be able to better explain more clearly explain how those products are aligned with these regulations. And maybe important to note that there are many ways to address ESG issues and human rights issues. And obviously, divestment is a way that's probably most investors often get attention or pressure to divest. But before reaching the divestment decision, there are many other ways to incorporate ESG, and that's the engagements that we do. It's one way, and we think it's a very important way to address this. So while holding stake in companies, we exercise our rights as shareholders to have meetings with companies and senior management and the board to influence their behaviors. And this is very important for index funds, especially because it's very difficult and impossible to divest from these funds. And we also use proxy voting rights. That, as I mentioned, that's our part of our role. And so when we exercise our votes at AGM or EGM sometimes, at director election or to support our shareholder proposal, but we have a policy to address wider environmental and social issues when we cast votes. So we look at companies' performance against various international norms, and if we have identified relevant breaches of conventions, then we may consider voting against the key director, for example. So there are many ways that we address human rights in our work. So yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Sachi, thank you very much. That was great to hear about your approach and how you incorporate considerations around due diligence, regulation and performance into your ESG ratings. So now move on to the Q&A session in the interest of time. So if I could ask all of the panelists to turn on their cameras, thank you very much. And my first question will actually be to Tatiana from the European Commission. So we have seen criticism that the EU conflict minerals regulation didn't go far enough in terms of having a practical impact on conflict minerals and a practical impact on the ground, as you mentioned. And I was wondering, how is the European Commission planning to address this, either in the forthcoming review of the regulation or some of the other laws and regulations and initiatives that you mentioned?
Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you for the question. So I'm afraid I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but I think it's very crucial to highlight that the limited time that the regulation has been in application. So given the fact that it has only been fully applicable for one year and a few months, and the fact that there are still these information gaps, I think even upstream where the regulation is mandatory, let's say, where the due diligence requirements apply, there is lack of knowledge and understanding of the functioning of the regulation, of the obligations that it entails. So I think this is an ongoing process, and it's quite early to tell whether or not the regulation has achieved its objectives. Of course, as you said, this is something that we will very, very closely try to identify and look at with this first review that is due next year, and then again 3 years thereafter in 2026. But I think one key area to highlight here is that it's, again, very difficult to identify and attribute the specific effects of the conflict minerals regulation to the regulation, and to distinguish this from all the other local regional realities, regional regulatory frameworks, or other due diligence initiatives and regulations from around the world. So Dodd-Frank Act notably, but also other regulations mentioned also by Sachi, for example. So we will try to address this in the upcoming review and to really look at the functioning and effectiveness of the regulation. But I think at this stage it's quite soon to tell what the specific shortcomings are or the specific successes, let's say. Also because some of the supporting tools that I mentioned earlier during my intervention, including the recognition of supply chain due diligence schemes, has taken longer than expected due to the COVID pandemic. So yes, we will try to address this certainly in this review, and to try to identify at least some first areas where we will more closely look at in the future, and to see to what extent then for the next review in 2026, there might be need for modifications in the regulation to better address those challenges or possible shortcomings. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana, and we look forward to seeing the results of that review. So my next question will be for Rebecca. And so the due diligence regulations that we mentioned earlier, even if they recognize different industry schemes, they will point to multiple schemes, and it's unlikely that they will point to just one standard. Is it a concern to you that there may be an uneven playing field with some industry schemes having very high standards and others having low standards?
Yes, I do think it's a concern, actually. And that really comes to that last slide that I showed, and the elements of what make a strong standard, right? So when you think about, so industry schemes, I think the industry associations certainly have their place within this landscape in terms of helping their members improve, and in terms of being a place where their members can come together and talk about ways for their particular industries to change. And yet the truth of it is that at many of those tables, civil societies, voices and perspectives are not equally represented. And that's so important when it comes to the actual requirements and the standard, and then also how audits are carried out. And so I do think that if a particular standard is not named, I do think that criteria for the standards does need to be named, right? So that it needs to be multi-stakeholder, that audits need to take into account more voices than just what's happening at the mine site. And then I'll just come back to this idea of the idea of very detailed requirements. Not only does it allow auditing to happen, but basically it allows for, again, that more of an even playing field, right? So if you say, have a stakeholder engagement plan, and then you have 12 steps to say what a robust stakeholder engagement plan looks like, which is what we lay out, then that helps a company to really understand, if I'm doing stakeholder engagement correctly, it looks this, and this way. But if you simply say, have a stakeholder engagement plan, for one company, that might be a memo that they've shared internally, right? And it stayed there. For another company, it could be 3 different people working on it, a manual for how they proceed with it, and an active stakeholder engagement process that's ongoing, right? So they can look very different if you don't detail out exactly what's meant to be in each of those. So that is really important, the detail and how the audit is undertaken.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'll ask the next question to Sachi. So I think a general criticism of the investment community has been that you're looking at the big picture, and I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the trends in the sort of data that you're collecting and assessing in your ratings, and how they will sort of define in more detail what kind of due diligence is expected of companies.
Yeah, so I think that, as I mentioned, there are many ways to integrate ESG in the investment process, and some people may do more kind of rigid, strict, quantitative method, but some, others may use both narrative, qualitative data as well as quantitative data. And even within HSBC, we have different approaches that we have some themed products that where selection of stocks is based on certain criteria, whereas there are many other products and more kind of traditional products where we try to integrate ESG in a broader way, or through engagement and other ways that, as I mentioned. We have also been involved in co-filing of shareholder proposals, for example. So there are many ways to do this, and so I'm not sure this big picture criticism, how what this exactly is at, but I guess also it's very difficult for investors who invest in vast number of companies across different geographies to perhaps go into as much detail as on every single issue. So this mineral supply chain issue is very important for us, but there are a number of issues that we engage in, and climate change it's a huge challenge, and we get lots of pressure from clients and everyone, and to spend a lot of time on. So I'm not saying that we should be lazy, but we also work with industry experts, and we also look at different ratings agencies assessments. We look at multiple sources, including open sources, to, I guess, reach a conclusion ourselves, and also importantly through our direct engagement with companies. And that, I think this is very important, because often rating agencies assessment, that they're very useful, but we won't trust just one source and straight away we make decisions. It doesn't work like that. So when we engage with a company, we may reference those rating results, but we then test what the company has to and what the ratings say, and then what the company is doing without maybe publishing, and then press them to change. So I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I'm afraid we'll have to stop our discussion. We have had lots more questions coming in from the audience, so what we will do is make sure that those are passed on to our panelists. I would like to thank you for your interventions and for your participation. It's been a very interesting and insightful discussion. Also, thank you very much for joining.